Okay, I think we'll get started. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for being here. My name is Emily Riley. I'm the Director of Public Engagement at Bard Graduate Center, and I'm really delighted to welcome you to today's program. I am a white woman with curly auburn hair. I'm wearing brown circular framed glasses and a red top with a pink pattern on it. I'm sitting in my living room beside a window. There are lots of plants behind me and a framed picture of a dog playing a piano. I'd like to start by acknowledging the land we're hosting this event from. Many cities and institutions in America were founded on the exclusions and erasures of many indigenous peoples, including those on whose land, Mannahatta, from which we are hosting this event today. The land of the 5 boroughs that make up New York City are the traditional homelands of the Lenape, Merrick, Canarsie, Matinecock, and Rockaway nations. Despite systemic erasures, these lands persist as intertribal trade lands under the stewardship of many nations and over 115,000 intertribal Native American, First Nations, and Indigenous peoples who currently call New York City home. If you'd like to learn more about the land you are on, I will post a link in the chat shortly so you can look it up. In addition, I would like to acknowledge those whose ancestors did not arrive on these shores of their own free will and whose tremendous cultural, economic, and technological contributions continue to provide the foundations of our lives. Welcome to Curators on Curating, Threads of Power with Emma Cormack, Ilona and Michele Majer. Emma Cormack is an associate curator at Bard Graduate Center. Ilona is curator for collections and exhibitions at the Textilmuseum Gallen. And Michele Majer is assistant professor at Bard Graduate Center, specializing in European and American fashion and textile history from 18th through 20th century. This is our penultimate program at Bard Graduate Center this summer. We have one more next week as part of our collaboration with Chinatown Art Brigade, and I will also post information for that in the chat momentarily. A couple of housekeeping things. You can enable closed captioning. It's AI closed captioning by clicking the CC button in your bottom toolbar. We will have time for a Q&A. There'll be a presentation from the curators, and then we will address questions. So feel free to submit questions through the Q&A function whenever they come up for you. And we're going to reserve the chat for sharing appreciations for this program. So thank you so much for being here, and I'm going to pass it over to Emma Cormack, who's going to get us started. Thank you.
Thank you, Emily, and hi everyone. Thanks for joining us today. We're really looking forward to sharing our upcoming exhibition with you. It's co-organized by BGC and the Textilmuseum St. Gallen in St. Gallen, Switzerland, and it'll open at BGC in September of 2022. So today I'm joined by my co-curators Ilona and Michele, and we're very happy to tell you a bit about the organizing themes of the exhibition, as well as share short previews of some of the objects we're planning to include. So this will be the first large-scale lace exhibition in the US in many years, and it'll also be the US debut of over 150 pieces of lace spanning the 16th to the 20th century, all from the Textilmuseum's extensive collection. We'll also have books, works on paper, painted portraits, fashion drawings and photographs, and of course garments to help tell the story of lace and fashion through the objects in this collection. So the BGC exhibition is growing out of an exhibition organized at the Textilmuseum in 2018-2019, which you can see here in these installation photos. This show was curated by Barbara Carl, and it explored lace as a signifier of status, luxury, and power from the 16th to the 18th century. Our exhibition at BGC follows many of the same organizing themes, but we have also expanded it to include discussion of lace worn in 18th century Spanish colonies in the Americas. And we've also expanded in terms of timeline to discuss the rise of machine-made lace in the 19th and 20th centuries, as well as lace in contemporary fashion. Let me just get these videos going. So before I hand it over to Michele and Ilona to talk a little bit more in depth about some of the objects in the galleries, I'm going to share a brief 10-minute overview of the themes of the exhibition and the different categories of objects we're using to tell this story in the gallery. So I hope this will give you a taste of the show as a whole. And of course, for more specifics, you have to come visit us next September. So the first floor of the exhibition, where the show begins, will include an introduction to the two handmade lace techniques that you see in these videos here, needle and bobbin lace. So here, wall text, objects, and the videos here will explain that in making needle lace, the lace maker uses a needle to stitch onto a backing material, often printed on parchment, a pattern printed on parchment. Bobbin lace is also built up on a parchment pattern backing, but instead of a single thread and needle like you see here, it's made using multiple threads and a set of bobbins that are usually attached to a curved surface of a hard pillow, like here in the corner. The threads here are twisted, looped, plaited, and woven, and as the lace maker progresses, pins are inserted to hold the threads in place and keep them taut. So one idea and challenge that we're working through curatorially here on the first floor is the question of terminology and how to communicate the differences between other techniques that are sometimes grouped in with lace, including embroidery, cut work, and white work. The explanation of these distinctions could be, for example, a panel on the wall with images. It could be a printed takeaway that we offer to visitors when they come in the door, or it could be some sort of digital element in the gallery. But at this point, we're leaning toward including an example of each of these different techniques in a case at the beginning to really underline the differences in these different making processes. And what's really important to us on this first floor is to introduce and foreground this making process. We want visitors to immediately have a grasp of how these objects were made so that they can then carry this knowledge throughout the other galleries, better understanding the objects on display, and also keeping in mind that this very detail-oriented process is time-intensive labor that goes into these objects. So also on the first floor, we'll include several books. Lace pattern books like those you see here on the top left. This is a genre of printed book that emerged in the 1520s in Central Europe. And also included here are botanical books like this one on the right that speak to inspirations for floral motifs that you'll see in examples of lace from the Textilmuseum collection. And you'll see here too that we're planning to pair pieces of lace with painted portraits to give a sense of how these objects were worn on the body, which you'll see throughout the exhibition. So for example, these lace pieces here will likely be flat in a case, and we want to give people a sense of how they were worn on the body and how you get this transparency over skin or over textile. So moving up to the second floor of the gallery, the exhibition will continue with a small section discussing ecclesiastical lace, and then move into an exploration of fashions and lace worn at the Habsburg court and in the 18th century Spanish colonies, including Mexico, Peru, and New Granada. Here again, wherever possible, we're pairing Textilmuseum lace with portraits of sitters wearing similar pieces. And I'm guessing that most of you in attendance today have probably been to BGC. And if so, you know that because our gallery spaces are in a 19th century townhouse, they're quite intimate, which really creates a special and unique viewing experience. But this also means that we don't have the same huge amount of real estate that other larger museums have. So one challenge that we're grappling with here is in terms of display. These two portraits on the right are close to life size, and actually many of them on our checklist are quite large. So we're working through ideas about how we might present or reproduce objects in ways that are most helpful for our visitors, whether that's digitally on a screen that enables you to zoom in very closely and inspect a lace collar or a lace cuff, or something more sophisticated. So all of the objects on the checklist and the Textilmuseum lace pieces in particular really invite close looking. And with our exhibition designer, we want to support that wherever possible. Another room on the second floor will focus on styles and lace worn at the Bourbon French court. Here again, we'll show Textilmuseum lace alongside additional portraits and 3 total garments, including 2 18th century gowns like this one on the left and a man's court suit. Again, giving visitors an idea of how the lace that is laying flat in the case looked when worn on the body over textiles and skin. So in this section in particular, our checklist is very heavy with lace pieces from the Textilmuseum. So with our designer, we're working through the challenge that is organization of many objects in a relatively small space. We're weighing whether to organize chronologically by type, because we have several examples of lappets, collars, and caps, which Michele will talk about more in a minute, or for example, by region where they were made. So also here, again, is the question of display, because as you can imagine, some of these pieces are quite fragile. So our plan now, in this room in particular, is to group the objects by type. So for example, this lappet you see in the center here, we have, I think, 6 examples of lappets from the 18th century. And in terms of display, we are also planning at this time to display the lappets hanging. So you have some sense of how they would hang from a woman's head that you don't necessarily get when it's laying flat like in this photograph. So here again is this, this balance between conservation and display requirements and being true to how the objects were used and worn. Up onto the 3rd floor, we transitioned from handmade lace into the machine-made laces of the late 19th century with a discussion of styles that take inspiration from historic lace and as well as those that are more innovative. So here we'll also explore different types of lace, including chantilly, like on this amazing pink dress here. And also on this floor, we'll have a section of 20th century couture garments that feature lace made by St. Gallen based manufacturing companies such as Forster-Rohner, which are these pieces on the right. Ilona will highlight a few of the objects from this section after Michele speaks. And finally, the last room in the exhibition will stretch into the present, exploring the use of lace by St. Gallen-based manufacturing companies again, including Forster-Rohner, in contemporary couture, including these 3 ensembles here we're hoping to borrow for the show. Here we'll also incorporate discussion of experimental lace techniques created by companies including Jakob Schlepfer, which you see on the right. Actually still in the works here is an idea to incorporate some selection of lace that visitors could touch and handle to get a sense of the tactility of, for example, what are sometimes called printed laces made out of silicone or other materials. So again, here, just like on the 1st floor, a focus on the creation process gives visitors an understanding of these different types of lace, like cutout lace here and chemical lace, that are in use by designers today and will be on display in the gallery. So that's a whirlwind tour of the exhibition as it stands now, and I'm going to hand it to Michele, who is going to take us back down to the 2nd floor to discuss one of the star objects from the Textile Museum collection that we're very excited to include in the exhibition.
Thank you, Emma. So yes, as Emma was saying, really throughout the 2nd and 3rd floors, we are showing how lace was an integral component of men's and women's dress in the 17th, 18th, and then into the 19th centuries. In the 17th and 18th centuries, particularly in the form of accessories, whether that's headwear or sleeve ruffles or on the garment itself. On the left, you see an Italian painting, a portrait of Angela Maria Lombardi from about 1710, showing the sitter in yards of needle lace that decorate the fronts of her gown, her cuffs, and her petticoat, as well as she's wearing a separate tour de gorge around the neckline of her dress. And she's wearing triple lace engageante or sleeve ruffles. On her head, she's wearing a type of headdress that was called at the time a fontange. And so that we would pair this painting with this very rare surviving needle lace fontange on the right from the Textile Museum collection. This form of headdress came into vogue in the late 17th century, around 1680, and they were at their highest around 1700, and they go out of fashion around 1710. And as you can see, the fontange has attached lappets to it. Emma was just showing you a slide of a single lappet that's now detached from whatever it was worn with the cap. And what's also unusual about the portrait on the left is that the sitter is wearing a dress made of a so-called bizarre silk. These silks were popular circa 1690 to 15, and they're characterized by these very large asymmetrical compositions with exotic motifs. And what was typical is to line the skirts of the overgown with a contrasting color or contrasting fabric, which you see here. And just quickly, I'm showing you two slides, two late 17th century engravings. On the left is the Duchess of Portsmouth, or as she was misspelled in French, Portsmouth. I don't know how that would be pronounced. She is wearing a very high lace fontange with lappets. So you see how that's, again, how you see that that's worn on the head. And the image that you see on the left, this kind of fashion engraving showing a single figure, male or female, were produced in great numbers in France at the very end of the 17th century. And they essentially functioned as a form of fashion communication before there is a real regular fashion press. And she's also wearing, as you can see, lace engageant and possibly lace on her petticoat, perhaps that upper flounce. On the right is an engraving by François Trouvin, by L'Armessin, showing the Habit de Majer from 1695. This is from a series of similar engravings showing artisans and those who worked in the guilds. So here we have the lingère, and so she's the intermediary. And I think that part of the story that we want to tell is how the lace got from the maker to the wearer, right? So the lingère in the 17th and 18th centuries would have been the woman dealing in these kinds of accessories and garments that incorporated lace. So she herself is wearing a very high fontange. Over her shoulders, she has sort of sleeves, large sleeves that are fontange as well. And her upper body, her upper torso, as you can see, is actually like a little chest of drawers, which contain different types of lace. They're indicated Flanders or Flandre, Malines. There's also a little drawer for rabat, so men's collars. In her right hand, she holds a man's cravat with lace ends. And on the shirt that's directly at the center front of that table in front of her, we see the lace trimming on the man's shirt. And so the lingère were the women who sold these kinds of luxury materials to clients. And this last image that I'm showing you, again, on the left, we have an object from the Textilmuseum, a Brussels or bobbin lace cap from about 1720. And on the right is a pastel by Coipel, showing Philippe Coipel and his wife in 1742. And part of what we'll talk about also in the exhibition is the changes in fashion, i.e. headwear. So around 1700, you have the very high fontange and very elaborate sort of towering hairstyles. That changes by the early 18th century, certainly by 1720. As you can see in the pastel on the right, the woman's hair is much closer to her head. And instead of that towering fontange, she wears a close-fitting lace cap. And as Emma was talking about, we're thinking of showing objects of which we have multiple examples together, so that the viewer can see, the visitor can see the changes in stylistic, in design change within lace over the course of the 18th century. And early in the 18th century, as you see with this cap here, the patterning is very dense. You see very little of the mesh ground. By the end of the 18th century, that's really changed. There's the mesh ground is much more in evidence, and the floral and foliate motifs are very reduced in scale. And I'll read you a very short quote from the Mercure de France, which was a periodical published in France starting the late 17th century and intermittently reported on fashion. So in February 1726, the Mercure is reporting on fashionable hairstyles that might be left entirely unadorned, or they're saying they could be worn, quote, without a ribbon or a cornet, which is a type of linen cap, unless it is very small with the peak scarcely visible at the top of the forehead, which gives an air of youth that is completely gallant. It also noted that embellishments and caps, quote, are always very small, very low, and very light, and they are made of plain muslin, gauze, or silk lace. So again, this what we really hope to do is show how important lace was in the tout ensemble for men and women throughout the 18th century.
Oh, Ilona, you're muted.
On the third floor of the gallery, we started with the 19th century, and the 19th century was the period when lace manufacture was mechanized. An important technology, which I do not want to hide, was based on the further development from the tulle production. Tulle is the base on which lace of the 18th century often was produced. Machines developed in England ended up in France in the 19th century in Calais, where a center for the manufacture of so-called levers lace was established. In St. Gallen in Switzerland, as in Plauen in Germany, the focus was on a different procedure. The region of St. Gallen was the center of hand embroidery around 1800, with tens of thousands of female hand embroiderers. From the 1830s onward, people tinkered with an embroidery machine, the so-called hand embroidery machine, which was eventually used industrially. In the video, you can see how a museum employee, Maria Weber, operates such a machine. She sits in front of the pantograph on which a technical drawing is applied. With a long lever, she follows the drawing, places a thick pointing needle where the next stitch is to be made, and then operates other levers and pedals. The machine will pierce needles through the fabric, 52 at a time. It is still a manual system, but it has already accelerated the embroidery process considerably. Such machines were set up in factories, but also in specially converted private houses for home workers. Against tradition, from then on it was mostly men who embroidered. The women and many children worked as unskilled workers, threading needles, controlling and manually improving the finished embroideries. After 1865, the USA in particular grew into an important customer market for these products. At the beginning of the 20th century, the region around St. Gallen was the world's largest embroidery producer. From the middle of the 19th century on, maybe you wonder why I'm now always talking about embroidery, because this is an exhibition about lace, but let me explain this now. From the middle of the 19th century, in addition to embroidery, lace for women's clothing became fashionable again. This prompted the embroidery manufacturer to look for a solution to produce lace with their technology. As one possibility, the cutting out of the fabric base after embroidering was introduced. In the 1880s, another solution was found that quickly became widespread, the chemical dissolution of a fabric base. It was important that the embroidery thread consisted of a different material than the fabric base, a material that did not decompose when the base was removed. And it was also important that the embroidery patterns were worked so closely together that the pattern would not fall apart. On the left of this slide, you can see such a chemical lace before and after the dissolution process. For this purpose, cotton was embroidered on an acetate base, which was then dissolved with acetone. On the right, you can see a cut-out embroidery in the chemical lace, both pieces from the early 20th century. Chemical lace was made in varieties of styles, which will be evident in the exhibition. Often, especially in the early years, the different types of hand lace were imitated. The fragment shown here, the one below, imitates, for example, a Venetian lace of the late 17th century. The compilation of a rich treasure trove of templates was one of the reasons for the creation of the lace collection that is now at our museum in St. Gallen. So this lace could be studied by the manufacturers and also by the designers. The chemical lace was one of the high quality products of the St. Gallen industry, the industry that also produced many inexpensive, simple white embroideries. The lace was used for fashion as trimmings for elegant women's dress, as you can see here on these photos. The photo on the left was taken in Longchamp, Paris, where famous horse races took place. The woman with the umbrella wears a dress decorated with a large patterned chemical lace. The Paris horse races were considered the most important places to witness fashionable society ladies. Couturiers also often sent their models wearing new designs to mingle with the crowd and hopefully attract new clients. The right photo was taken in New York by the photographer Joel Federer. The woman's dress is also trimmed with chemical lace, probably with one made of metallic threads, as it is shimmering. Both photos are preserved in the archive of Fritz Bau, which suggests that the lace is made by his company, as it is a common practice for the embroidery producers to collect images of fashion models made of their collections. When the second photo was taken, in 1915, the St. Gallen industry had already passed its zenith. The outbreak of the First World War marked a decisive turning point. Even after that, in the 1920s, severe crises followed, which resulted in unemployment and poverty for the region's very one-sided economy. Embroidery continued to be produced in St. Gallen, but on a much smaller scale. Some of the producers managed to keep up with the highly competitive market and produce for haute couture and pret-à-porter fashion. You can look forward to a nice selection of such models in the exhibition. Emma gave a first glimpse into this selection already.
Yes, thank you very much. So yes, I hope this makes you want to come visit next September. And we have plenty of time for questions now, so I'll hand it back to Emily. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. So as we said before, if you want to ask questions, please just post them in the Q&A function. While everyone hopefully types, I'm gonna kick us off with a couple of questions. So, Emma, especially in your intro, you talked a lot about the sort of process of making. And I'm wondering if you could say more about how you're thinking as a curatorial team of bringing more of that sort of embodied practice into the gallery.
Yes, I'll let Ilona start this one because I think this is something that they do quite often at the Textile Museum. So let me go back to my slide from earlier.
Yes, as Emma mentioned, we had a part of this show in our gallery here, and we produced 2 videos that show a lace maker by her work. On the right side, you see her producing a bobbin lace, and on the left side, she's making a needle lace. And we are going to show these 2 videos that people can understand the technique and see how a lace is made and what time it will take as well. It will take its time to follow the movies. And what you see also here is a bobbin lace pillow of the 19th century with a partly finished work on it. You will see how many bobbins it will take for just a very simple piece of bobbin lace. And we have this, we call it a small lace cool. 9 pieces of papers. The first one showing the preliminary drawing of a needle lace, and the last one is showing a finished needle lace. And then we have 7 pieces that show step by step in between.
So in addition to these pieces and, for example, this Diderot image showing a selection of bobbin lace tools, we're also very excited that we'll be working with lace maker Ilona, who I think is here today, to commission a piece of lace to be on display on the first floor of the gallery. So if you are a lace lover in attendance today, I'm sure you know who she is. But we hope that this process of her creating this new piece can speak to really the incredible amount of work and time and skill that goes into making these pieces, which can be really quite large, as you'll see in the gallery.
And one more question for me before we jump into the Q&A submissions. You know, here at BGC, I know we often produce a very extensive catalog that's a sort of compendium of often new research that goes alongside our exhibitions, because that's a priority as a teaching institution to kind of share that kind of scholarship in conjunction with our exhibitions. I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit more about the difference between the catalog and the exhibition. How are you thinking about them right now in terms of what they'll cover, or what the catalog will delve into in more depth?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, sure. So like all of the BGC exhibition catalogs, they go much deeper in depth than the gallery exhibition does. So we're right now the catalog has 17 chapters. So the first 4 chapters are translated texts, 3 from the Textilmuseum exhibition catalog from 2018-2019, including information about the history and context of their collection, lace as a signifier of luxury and status, fashion and lace through 1790, and marketing lace in, for example, Antwerp and Brussels between 1550 and 1750. And then after those translated chapters, we move into our newly commissioned pieces. So we'll be including chapters on lace and lace production in Italy, in early modern Italy, lace pattern books and sample books by Femke Spielberg. I think she's here today. Fashion and lace in portraiture at the Spanish court, for example. And then we have 3 chapters about lace and fashion in the Spanish colonies. So one focusing on clothing as a signifier of status, one focusing on lace in Peru and Mexico, and then another one focusing on New Granada. And I'll let Michele talk about the second half of the book.
Oh, Michele, I think you're muted.
There we go. Sorry, I'm clicking the wrong little red icon. So yes, so as Emma was saying, so we have commissioned new chapters from curators, from professors, and from independent scholars working here in the US and also in Europe. And so additional chapters will focus on French fashion and lace in the 17th and 18th centuries, lace and the French economy under Louis XIV, lace and sumptuary laws in Switzerland. And Emma and I had a conversation yesterday with that author who showed us some really wonderful images that are completely unfamiliar to me, and I think will be very unfamiliar to you know, an American audience in general. We have a chapter on the British lace revival in the late 19th century. So again, this is something that we don't have the space and so on to address in the exhibition, but there was a big lace revival in Europe in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. We have a former BGC, an alum, a BGC alum, who will be writing about the Italian lace revival in 19th century New York. Emma and I will be writing a chapter on 19th century lace and fashion in France and Britain. We have an author who will be writing a chapter on lace and 20th century fashion. So sort of picking up, I guess, sort of around that, when Saint Gallen, sort of the height of the Saint Gallen production, going through to the end of the 20th century. And then Emma, do you want to mention the interview?
Yes, I'll let Ilona, if you want to say a word or two about it.
Okay, there will 2 interviews be included. One with the family member of the Verona family, one of the most creative embroidery factories here in St. Gallen, and the other one will be the fashion director. Now he has retired, but he was for a very long time the fashion director of Jakob Schlepfer, also a embroidery factory here in St. Gallen that's with Martin Leuthold.
Great, thank you. So I'm going to drive on over to these questions in the Q&A. I'm going to, I guess, send this one over to Michele, but regarding the laces from the Americas, are these from the extensive export industry from Belgium and France through ports in Spain to the New World in the 18th century?
So actually, that's a really good question, which if one of our authors were here, I would turn over to him, because that is a question that's come up in discussion just with Emma, is where is that lace coming from? But my assumption is that it is coming from the main lace making centers.
Great.
I understand from this from James Middleton, who's the author to whom I was referring, that a lot of the textiles worn by sitters that we see in those portraits were actually coming from the Far East. But my assumption would be that the lace is coming from Europe.
Great, and if that the person Michele just mentioned is in the audience, feel free to post in the chat, and I'll make sure I share that information out loud. Will the exhibition be online is a question, and my answer is yes. I can say that for sure. We're very committed to creating digital versions of our exhibitions. COVID has taught us that there's a real need for that, and so there will be a version of the exhibition online for folks who are not in New York or can't get to New York to be able to explore.
And can I just add something there?
Yeah.
Like Emily said, yes, there will be an online component to the exhibition. And also Michele is teaching a class in the fall for our BGC students, and we're expecting actually that the students will be involved in helping us craft that online experience. So that is special because yes, if you can't make it to New York, it'll be available, but then it'll also be available in perpetuity afterward. So
great.
Maybe I can just add on here that the class, which is still a work in progress, but will obviously certainly cover what the exhibition covers in terms of chronology and geography, but I'm also assuming that we will be more wide-ranging in terms of looking at lace made in other parts of the world, and yes, very much using the class as a kind of workshop to think about the presentation and the interpretation of the material in the exhibition, and certainly getting students involved in the digital component.
Great. Yeah, and I will just say, like, this is a project in progress still, so there's still, we don't have all the answers yet, and there's still a certain amount of fluidity in terms of where we'll land with the final exhibition. A question here about Carrick Macross lace. Is there any Carrick Macross lace in the St. Gallen collection?
I think, yeah. I think Ilona would probably say no, but I don't know.
Can you repeat what type of lace?
Carrick Macross.
No, I don't think so.
No. Okay. I'm going to scoot on down to a question here from BGC curator Earl. I believe you said that both men and women wore lace before the 19th century. Will this exhibition include men's fashions as well as women's? And will there be an examination of why lace went largely out of fashion for men? I'm going to throw this question over to Emma, and you can direct.
Yes, so we will include, like I said, on the second floor, we have one man's court suit from the Textilmuseum collection. And we also are hoping to include several portraits and images of men. Because originally they were historically very, very decked out in lace, and then that goes out of fashion. So Michele or Ilona, if you want to add anything else.
Yes, I mean, that's definitely the case after the late 18th century, and certainly, a watershed event like the French Revolution. Men are not wearing lace, and all the decoration is, on women. And I'm not sure quite. I mean, so the fact that men are wearing lace will certainly be addressed on the second floor of the exhibition, and this is something that we'll have to think about in terms of transitioning to the third floor, maybe on the landing, where we have that vivid fuchsia aniline pink dress with the black lace, is a place to talk about the fact that lace was really in the 19th century and beyond, worn by women, and also I think in Catherine Normand's chapter on 20th century lace, she talks about the fact that we see lace in lingerie, which were certainly not the case in the earlier, in the 17th, 18th, even most of the 19th century. You don't necessarily see the extravagant use of lace in lingerie. So that's also something that we don't necessarily think about, like, unseen lace on the body.
And I would just add in here that we have been talking a little bit about addressing this question in programming, the sort of like gendered nature of lace, this question about its connection with sensuality in the body, and why it's become this very female associated material when it didn't start out that way. So that's something we've just been talking about addressing through programs as well. While we're sort of, there's two questions here that seem like they're a little connected, so I'm going to push them together a little bit. One is here from Laura. With regard to large-scale lace, deep, wide flounces and hems, can you comment on repurposed or custom-made applications as furnishing lace in the liturgical setting and domestic interiors 17th and 18th century? And I think there's another question here about if this sort of incorporation of lace into interiors is a concern of the exhibition or not.
So maybe Ilona would add on to this, but we're really dealing primarily with lace worn on the body. We will have a couple of pieces, like the ecclesiastical pieces on the second floor, a large antependium, and the what would we call it, Ilona? The cover, the square piece, the Spanish piece, which was furnishing and not for the body. But yes, we are primarily looking at lace worn by men and women. And so maybe Ilona can speak more to this, but in terms of repurposed, but I know from the textile end of things that it was not uncommon for men and women, affluent men and women who had rich clothing, to donate that clothing to the church, and it would subsequently be made into copes, other kinds of ecclesiastical vestments, and textiles used in the liturgy as part of the mass.
What we do have in our collection are also a lot of borders, large scale or long pieces of lace, which we cannot really say for which purpose they were made. They could have been used for furnishing as well as for dressing.
Great. I'm trying to group questions, hence my sort of.
Can I just add on here?
Go ahead, Michele. Yeah.
That as we were saying, we're dealing just kind of very briefly with lace for the church, but even though there was undoubtedly repurposed lace and repurposed textiles used in the church was throughout this period a major consumer of high-end textiles and lace. So even if they were receiving gifts from wealthy donors of textiles and lace, they were also buying lace to be worn by the clergy and to be used, in the church itself. So we should remember that the church had a lot of money and they're spending it on expensive textiles.
Great. This may be another question for you, Michele. This is from Lucy Chudson. Can you contextualize how women would select particular lace designs for personal wardrobe needs or desires? Would a client visit the lace maker directly to learn about and discuss options, or would this type of choice making go through the sort of fashion clothing designer or tailor, dressmaker? The question is sort of curiosity about the client customer process and experience with lace.
So if we're talking about the 18th century, I would say that the client, a woman is going to like the lingère, and looking at different laces. Lace, you would also wear different laces depending on whether you're accessorizing a more or less formal dress, right? So certain kinds of lace would be more suitable for a very formal dress to be worn at a court occasion or something like that, versus what you might wear for something just like your everyday attire, or sometimes, certainly women aren't necessarily wearing lace all the time. They might be wearing accessories made of plain muslin, or white work, which is some embroidered muslin, which is something that we'll refer to briefly also on the first floor. And women are, I think people like the lingère and the seamstresses and so on. They are, obviously they are in touch with the makers of lace, the lace merchants. And so they are the ones who were sort of disseminating the latest fashions in lace. And one thing that I'm just thinking about in the 19th century, and something that I'm sure that Emma and I will refer to in our chapter, is the return of lace as a status symbol in the 19th century after the revolution and the sort of the early 19th century, and the rise in wealth sort of across the socioeconomic spectrum. And in a novel like Zola's Lady's Paradise, there are wonderful descriptions of women going to the department store that's based on the Bon Marché and looking at and touching and becoming, it's like sensory overload with these laces that they desire. So in that case, the department store is the purveyor or the and disseminator of these laces, and women could go and see a much wider range that they would have been able to see at the individual lingère in the 17th century. And I should maybe just add that the lingerie was an all-female guild in France during that period. So they are the ones who are making and selling these very, very fine linen garments, accessories, and also lace. So I hope that answered the question. Maybe.
I think it does, yeah. I'm gonna just thank the folks in the chat who qualified Carrick Macross, and then also Laurie Waters. It's an Irish lace formed from muslin motifs, either alone or applique on net with needle lace fillings. It's a mid-19th century lace that's still made today. So thanks for the amazing, knowledgeable folks in our audience. So Pat and Laurie, who clarified that type of lace for us. I have a question that I'm going to pull actually from the chat from Barbara about, is lace a strictly Western fabrication? So is lace a strictly Western fabrication? And then I think I might talk about a sort of public programs project that we've just started that sort of talks about, that sort of complicates that idea a little bit. But first question, is lace a strictly Western fabrication? Who wants to take this?
In terms of its origin or now?
I think maybe both. Originally, and sort of maybe if you do have knowledge about now, that would be great too.
Well, Ilona, I mean, yes, originally it's from Europe, but Ilona, would you like to?
I can start with this question. What is special about lace that it is a technique that was invented in Europe? A lot of techniques came from Asia to Europe first, but lace techniques actually were invented in Europe, probably in Italy, during the late Middle Ages or the early modern times. So that I'm talking of the two techniques, needle lace and bobbin lace. I don't know where else today lace is very common. Maybe someone else knows more about this.
Well, I'll just maybe talk a little bit about a project proposal that has come from an MA, first year MA student here at BGC, Mary Adeogun. And we're just beginning to think about how we might incorporate this, her research into the programming around the exhibition or other kind of digital aspects of the exhibition itself. So there's a sort of tidal turn where a lot of lace becomes exported to Nigeria and other parts of Africa. And there's a tradition of incorporating lace into Yoruba dress. And so Mary has sort of is working with us to figure out how we might share that research alongside this exhibition. Right now we're thinking it might be a podcast series, but we're still sort of evolving that idea, and Mary's still doing that research. But that's a really interesting sort of export trend that we can see at a certain point where the exports become very prolific to West Africa. So that's something that we've just started working on. Emma, I don't know if you want to say anything else.
I would just add to answer one of the other questions in the chat that what makes this exhibition different from other exhibitions of lace. That our focus here, of course, is that this is a loan show from the Textile Museum. So the bulk of the objects, the huge number of objects are showcasing the collection at the Textile Museum. And like I mentioned at the very beginning, this is special because they've never been to the US before. This will be their debut in New York.
And I just want to highlight some amazing activity happening in the chat with audience members sharing other ways in which lace is sort of traveling the globe throughout history. So thank you for those comments.
Emily?
Yeah, go ahead, Michele.
Something just popped into my head from a previous question having to do with, how women, like where would they go to shop for lace, or how would they know it was fashionable? Yesterday, I looked up for Leslie Miller, who's the curator at the Victoria and Albert Museum, who's writing the chapter on lace in French fashion in the 17th and 18th centuries. And she asked if I could get access to a letter from Abigail Adams to Thomas Jefferson, 1786, which she wasn't able to do, going through her, her internet access, whatever. Anyway, so I found this letter. It's a 2-page letter from Abigail Adams to Thomas Jefferson. Abigail Adams is in London, Thomas Jefferson is in Paris, and she asks him to please buy her some black lace, and she specifies the amount that she wants in terms of the unit of measurement of the time, which was an L, and the amount of money that she wants to spend. And she says that she needs this because this is what ladies at the English court are wearing. And then what's also really funny is she says, basically, like, I'm sure some nice gentleman could just stick it in his pocket, and bring it back, so that I can, wear it over here. So that's also, it's another way that people, men and women, shopped or acquired things in the 18th century, is that if you were outside of, major urban centers, or in the wrong major urban center, to get whatever it was, you had your friends shop for you. So this is also something that people asked their friends, their relatives to do all the time, was, well, since, while you're there, can you get me like the most fashionable, whatever it is. So that's also, that's part of the, that was also how you, right?
Thank you for that, Michele. And I'm realizing that some folks are commenting to just panelists. I'm going to read out a couple of comments, and then I'm going to come over to some other questions in the Q&A. There's a comment here in the chat that missionaries took lace making techniques around the world with them. A comment from Laurie Waters about, I might mispronounce this, so bear with me. Chankay woven gauzes are considered the major native lace of the Americas. And I'm just hunting for other comments that might not have made it all the way to our attendees. And oh, here's a great one from Cecilia. It's a little long, so I'll read maybe a little bit of it, but there is quite a bit of Egyptian Mamluk open work embroidery on linen items from the 9th to 14th century of the types that were imported into Italy. It is very similar to the early 16th century Italian open work that develops into cut work and needle lace. And Turkish over needle lace edgings that have been made from the 19th century, surviving Eastern Mediterranean textiles from the intervening centuries, are very rare. So it's hard to say whether this develops independently from Venetian or as part of the exchange of objects that was going on between Italy and the Ottoman Empire. So thank you for these comments, everybody. It adds so much to the conversation. There's a question here from Arlene about if any of the curators themselves are lace makers, and other ways in which lace makers are involved, and what made Bard decide to do a lace exhibition.
So I'll just say, I can speak for myself and I think Michele, but we're not lace makers. I hope throughout this process to learn, but that is why we're so happy to have Ilona Kanagilou involved in sort of helping to communicate the process throughout the exhibition, and also in programming. So BGC programming, if you've attended our events in the past, there's generally a good focus on making and making processes. So I expect that we will perhaps organize workshops or demonstrations, that sort of thing. And we are working on a new idea for our programming space in our gallery building. So maybe Emily, if you want to say a word or two.
Sure. Tentatively, we're hoping to turn that space into a maker space and have workshops and invite various lace guilds from all over the state to use it as a space to support their practice. We're also talking about having a rotating artist residency in that space as well. So we're really trying to bring this experience of the making aspect as a living art form into the gallery, so that visitors have the opportunity to both see historical examples, contemporary couture examples, but then also encounter making in process or in action in the gallery as well. So that's something we're really trying to think about how to do through programming and sort of like interventions in the gallery. In a dream scenario, we might have a lace maker positioned by one of these historical portraits, so you can see the process and sort of the portrait of it, and then it in reality as well. So that's a strong programming consideration right now, as well as we sort of get all our ducks in a row for next year.
And I know too, Ilona has mentioned their programming around the exhibition at the Textile Museum and some of the programs that they did. I remember you mentioned, or maybe it was Emily mentioned, learning lace techniques with very large, sort of oversized threads to really understand the knotting and the threading.
We used this type of oversized materials for other techniques, but it is a good way to learn, also to learn for children, for example. Maybe you'd like to include it, Emily. Or...
Yeah, we're still figuring our programming roster out. So there's a lot that hopefully we'll be able to do for this exhibition. I think, you know, there's a couple of very specific questions here that I'm going to ask very quickly. One is, did the Marchand de Mode also sell lace as a trim? And then another one, most long, wide 24-inch lengths of Belgian pieced laces of the early to mid 18th century were used as furnishing flounces, primarily in the bedroom and boudoir. So that's a comment from Laurie, but a question here about, did the Marchand de Mode also sell lace as a trim?
Yes, I think the Marchand de Mode did sell those, and I think that I'd have to look more closely, but I think there was rivalry between the Lingère and the Marchand de Mode in terms of selling those kinds of goods. So yes, I mean, the Marchand de Mode sold a much wider range of objects, or clothing related commodities, accessories and so on, than the Lingère. But yes, I think probably lace was among them, or lace trimmed, like a cape or something, at home cape or peignoir or something like that. But,
great. So we're almost at time for our program today, but there's a couple final questions that I'm going to try and smush together a little bit. So the question about whether this exhibition will tour outside of the US. Right now, from what I know, there's no plans for it to tour beyond BGC, but I want to check with Emma and co, Ilona and Michele.
So the exhibition will close at BGC in January of 2023. And we are interested in it touring. So I'm going to put my email address in the chat. And if you're interested, be in contact with me and I can give you more information.
And if there's, those in the audience that really want to follow up with further questions or learn more, feel free to email us. We're very open. And then I guess the final thing I might say, there's a question here about why this exhibition, why now? Some of it has to do with scheduling, and some of this has to do with, BGC makes it a priority to try and have shows that have never, where materials or histories that haven't been shown in the US before are shown. And, I guess from my perspective, I've been thinking a lot about how much labor and time goes into the making of lace. And so I think there's something here about highlighting the people that made it, alongside the kind of status symbols of that lace had in its history. So I think part of the sort of importance, or the way that I'm thinking in terms of programming about how to connect this exhibition to sort of contemporary concerns, or how we think about the world now, is thinking about this question of labor, the invisible makers, and then the very visible wearers, and sort of looking at that paradox in this exhibition. It's a historical example of that paradox, and I'm TBD, but we're excited to think about how to use that idea to explore other kinds of invisibilities of garment workers, doing programming that sort of looks at that paradox, the kind of paradox of luxury that still pertains today in a lot of the sort of high-end making practices. So I think that brings, Michele, go ahead.
Actually, so while we have all these lace experts in our audience, I was just thinking maybe I'll throw a question out to them, which is something that we've discussed in putting together, sort of, images for the exhibition. Why do we think that we see so many images, or that the surviving images that we see of lace makers in the 17th century, when these techniques, when lace becomes, very widespread, why are they bobbin lace makers? And why do we not see, as far as I know, needle lace makers? This is something I was discussing recently with a former curator from the Cooper Hewitt who's worked on lace, and he said, well, maybe it's because it's more active, to see a woman, depict a woman who's seated at a pillow with all these bobbins, and what that sort of entails. But when we were searching around on the Google, for images of women making lace in the 17th century, they're pretty much Northern European, and they're making bobbin lace. And so whether depicting somebody, doing what you see on the slide on the lower left, that could be embroidery and not necessarily lace. I mean, I don't know. It's just, it's really curious to me why there are these paintings at this particular moment, and that they show women making bobbin lace. So if anybody has any ideas, feel free to
post in the chat, or I'm gonna just spell Emma. It's not easy to copy and paste from Zoom, I know, so I'm gonna spell Emma's email out for folks. It's Emma, EMMA.Cormack, CORMACK @bgc.bard.edu. You can also just email gallery@bgc.bard.edu if you have any further questions. There's that email goes to lots of us. A comment here from Laura Erdos Fernandez. Interesting question. Many engravings depict tapestry centers, but not lace making centers. Perhaps they were trying to protect patterns via edits. And then Devon writes, there was a lot of bobbin lace making in the region of Flanders where the painters were active. So that might be one explanation. And Laurie Waters writes, there is only one French needle lace image from the late 19th century. The bobbin lace images largely come from Flemish areas, again, so where realistic painting was in vogue. The French and Belgian needle lace industries were highly protected and probably never imaged. And Cecilia writes, it's very interesting, perhaps because those sorts of genre scenes and working class subjects were more popular in the Low Countries where bobbin lace was the dominant technique. Some great thoughts coming in through the chat.
And I'll have to say thank you too for the suggestions of the museum in Berkeley and Sunnyvale and the European guilds. We really appreciate it.
Yes, thank you to those comments as well. And then one final comment here, needle lace portraits might be misinterpreted as embroidery. Le Brodeuse by Quellebois, what comes to mind? Well, in some ways I wish this had been just a regular old Zoom meeting so we could all keep talking, but thank you so much for spending time with us today. This exhibition will continue to evolve. Stay tuned on our website for updates, and we really hope those of you that are local and can make it will come to the exhibition in September. But enjoy the rest of your day, be safe, and thank you to Michele, Emma, and Ilona for sharing information with us. Thank you, everybody, and be well.
Thank you very much.